Hi friends of Jubilee Plus. In this week's Monday Mercy video, I want to talk to you about something that God has been speaking to me about recently. He's been talking to me about the merciful way in which He tells our stories. So much more merciful than I would tell my own story, and probably than I would tell anyone else's stories as well. Let me explain a bit about this. So recently I had the opportunity to spend a day with the Christian Social Impact Network, which was a day of coaching for leaders of Christian charities. And it was such a brilliant day, so helpful. The theme of the day was how we think about failure. And in one section of the day, we looked at characters in the Bible who have failed. And during that time, God gave me such a revelation of just the different ways in which He tells our stories to how we would tell our own stories or how we would judge the stories of others. He doesn't take snapshots of our lives in the way that I tend to do, but actually He sees the whole. Let me give you some examples from the Bible. So David, for example, if you ask me about David in the Old Testament, probably one of the first things I would tell you is that David committed adultery and then he murdered to cover up his adultery. But God's summary of David is that he was a man after God's own heart. That's what's repeated about him in the New Testament in Acts 13, that God says he's a man after my own heart. Now, how can that be? Well, it's because God knows the heart, but God also sees the whole. And God tells our stories, it seems, by looking at the best of us and not the worst of us, looking at our best moments, not our worst moments. Let's take Solomon, for example, David's son. I look at his life and I think he married hundreds of women and he shouldn't have done that. And it says that they turned his heart to other gods. I look at Solomon and think he was pretty foolish. Like, how is he famous for being wise? And yet he is. That is what he's famous for. And actually, when he's referred to by Jesus in the Gospels, it's about his wisdom and his glory, not about his foolishness. I find that really, really interesting. Hebrews 11 to me is fascinating because there's so many people mentioned in this passage about heroes of the faith, examples to us of faith who we're to imitate and follow their example. There's people listed I wouldn't have put there at all. Sarah, we're told that by faith she laid hold of the promises of God because she considered the one who had promised to be faithful. Yeah, I look back at Genesis and what I remember about Sarah and what I read about her is that when the promise of God came, the first thing she did was she laughed at it. And the second thing she did was she lied about laughing about it. So I think Sarah, woman of faith? No, I think she laughed at the promises of God and then she lied about laughing. And yet here she is mentioned in this list of men and women of faith that we are to imitate and we're to be like in our faith. Gideon's mentioned in that list too. If I was summing up Gideon for you, I'd say he had one moment of glory, but it was bookended by moments of kind of trying to get out of doing what God had asked him to do, setting out fleeces, really needing God to persuade him of what he'd said. And then after his success, building this golden ephod, and it says it was a snare to him and his family. So I don't think of Gideon as a great man of faith, and yet here he is in Hebrews 11, the Spirit-inspired scriptures call him a man of faith who we're to imitate. Even more surprising to me is that Samson makes the list. I can barely think of any redeeming features of Samson's life at all. And yet here he is in this list of men and women of faith. Moses is in the list too, and it's fascinating to me. I think about Moses, and when God said to Moses, I want you to go to Pharaoh, Moses seemed to give God all the reasons why he shouldn't do it, ultimately saying to God, please will you send someone else? And it says God was angry at Moses. And yet here in Hebrews 11, we are told that by faith, Moses wasn't afraid of Pharaoh. Peter in the New Testament, I think of him as the disciple who made the most mistakes, ultimately denying Jesus, saying, I don't know him, even though he'd said, I'll never let you down, Jesus, I'll never leave you, I'll never run away, I'll never deny you. And here he is, he denies Jesus. And yet Jesus says, on this rock I'll build my church. And Peter is one of the most famous apostles that we know about today. God's version of our stories seems to me to be so much more merciful than our own versions. And in my own life, I was recently telling my counsellor about these different men and women, about this day that I spent with the Christian Social Impact Network, and about this revelation that I'd had about how God tells our stories. And while I was talking to my counsellor about it, I suddenly remembered that at the beginning of August, God had said exactly the same thing to me about my own story. I was saying to God one day, I look back at my life and what I see is just mess. I see one messy, painful, mistake-ridden kind of incident after incident. I see that in terms of messes I've made of my own life from time to time, but also messes other people have made that have deeply and profoundly affected me. I look back and I can see things I regret, whether they're my own regrets or things I regret that have happened to me. I look back, and if I was summarising my life for you, I'd say it's been messy. But I felt God say to me, that is not the way he sees my life. Back at the beginning of August, and then just recently it came with fresh revelation to me, that when God looks back at my life, what he sees is mercy upon mercy upon mercy. That he has been merciful to me every day. Every day. His mercies have been new for me every day. And that actually my story isn't one of mess up after mess up. It's one of mercy upon mercy, mercy after mercy. Surely his goodness and mercy have followed me all the days of my life. And also I said to God, sometimes when I look back at my own life, I can just see all my failures. And God says to me, I see all your fights and how I've made you to be a fighter. God sees me as someone who has cried out to him time and time again for his mercy and laid hold of it by his grace, by his goodness, by his kindness. God tells our stories way more mercifully than we tell our own stories or than we tell other people's stories. So this week, why not be merciful to yourself, and why not ask God, how would he tell your story? What's his version of your life? Because I bet it's probably different to yours, and it's probably far more merciful than your own.